Start. Alrighty, so chapter 10 about psychological testing. Maybe we can start as we do in all the sessions with a check-in, just to share a little bit of how you are today, and then we can go like all the way with the chapter. What do you think? Yeah, just to say good morning. So
I will happily jump in. So the program I'm in is a combined MS PhD, and I just finished the MS portion this semester. I took my master's competencies, done, starting the PhD in the fall. So I'm feeling super, super relieved.
Nice. Congratulations.
I am still currently working for a testing company out of Toronto, and working from home and loving life.
Okay. And life is good?
Oh yeah.
Good. How about you, Maggie? How are you?
Just dissertationing, so I'm kind of in the middle of that, trying to get my committee to still agree to a date, which has been, I think, the hardest part of this process, which I wasn't expecting. I thought it would be sort of easy to schedule these people, but overall good. I'm excited. I can kind of see the end of the end of the road is coming, and I'm ready to be done. So getting there.
Nice. Are you looking for jobs now, or?
Yep, already applying for jobs, had some interviews, trying to figure out that next step too. So
yeah, good luck with that. I am good. A bit sleepy, but yeah, I think I'm fine. And also like working on dissertation stuff, and yeah, I received reviews from a paper that I submitted, and yeah, I need to work on that. There was one paper that I submitted that it was like, yeah, this is fine, you need to write it better. So I am working on that. And the second one was like, no. It was like, absolutely not, no, bye. That was harsh, but yeah, okay. Sorry, hold on. There is someone else. Joy. Alrighty, so chapter 10. What do you think about the chapter?
I feel like this one is so much more loose than other chapters. Like there's just so much more vagueness, and I mean, I think that's the nature of the beast, but compared to others, there's just so much more room for things being on the part of the people administering the test. There's just so much more vagueness and flexibility, and it's just a real contrast.
Yeah, way less technical, more just advising professionals to be professionals in testing.
Yeah.
I also kind of looking at the more technical side of it a little bit, like they're kind of leaving it up to the administrator or the test user to know what cases are best for these tests. And it's like, you might not even consider the fact that this wasn't normed for your subpopulation, or it's not appropriate for English language learners, or it's not appropriate for this kind of student. And you might not know. Like, I think a lot of people just kind of take these tests out of the box and are like, oh, great, this is perfect. And they just use it without like a second thought, really. So they may not know to even do that sort of interrogation of the work. So there's that too.
You know, I think that's an excellent point, and it applies to workplace testing as well, because I think there's a lot that get used in the workplace that's just handed to you by a supervisor who doesn't know anything about testing. And I mean, I guess the question there is that on the part of the test makers to control in some way?
I think there should be a big disclaimer at the start of this chapter that says, read the test manual. Because I think a lot of these things come down to actually knowing what the test is used for.
read the instructions.
Yeah.
Mm.
You know what's interesting too is this has a really long narrative that covers so many topics, but the actual standards are fairly brief. So I think it's interesting how disproportionate that is.
I was surprised actually with the way in which the chapter is sketched, in that it really enters into all types of psychological testings and describes them. I mean, yeah, I that kind of surprised me at some point. I wasn't expecting that. I mean, I can see that you need to enter into more detail somewhere about what is the testing in this area, but for some reason I felt it like no, I didn't see the value of doing that, such a supermarket list.
Mhm.
Because even if you do a list, still either they can change during time. But yeah, also it can be useful for kind of knowing what art is the state of the art in that particular area. But yeah, I don't know. I kind of got lost on why to sketch the chapter in that way.
I agree because everything is very broken down, and they have a little bit to say on a lot of things, but it doesn't really change what standards they have at the end of the narrative. And so I feel like they're saying an awful lot to not really have many standards related to it. And I don't know if there's anything that could be added, but it feels like an unfinished chapter in some way.
I thought the descriptions of the different types of the psychological assessments probably isn't necessary. A lot of the stuff that they talk about is, you know, it applies to all sorts of testing, like even like educational. Like a lot of your comments, Sergio said, like, what about in education as well? Like, yeah, they would apply in education, I think.
Yeah, when I was reading the chapter, it was like, this should be also applied. I mean,
Yeah.
how many times we fail in certain ways with educational testing because we are not doing the things that they are saying. Actually, for me, one thing that kind of like changed my brain was to see the idea of interpretation and how they deal with how do you interpret a score. And they are very clear in that interpretation cannot be done by the score itself, that you need to kind of contrast that with more information and with collateral, I think it's the name, the word they use. So, I mean, and that makes total sense. And I think when you read the validity literature in educational measurement, or when you, I don't know, like see through the standards actually, how the topic about interpretation is considered, is always considered the interpretation on the score by itself. So that presupposes that you can interpret the score by itself. And I don't know, I mean, maybe not. And even if you quote standardize the interpretation and you do your best effort to kind of like pre-do that, or I don't know, like see many times if when you take like this collateral information, then the interpretation of the score is relatively stable, still you never know. Still is something that you need to kind of check instantiation by instantiation. The same thing that kind of was interesting to see that in the chapter they speak about how to use battery of tests, like as the test set in conjunction with others, which is also saying that maybe in the initial chapters it's not that discussed, that you typically you speak about the validity of one test, but not necessarily about the validity of like a battery of tests. That enters in like slightly different realms, because if there is an argument, then it's like Marvel. We need to bring like many validity arguments that we need to speak together, and maybe all of them confluent in one extra argument that you have for the battery. Yeah, that was very interesting to me to kind of like see how to say the difference and really don't understand why we are not doing the same, because it's the same thing. I mean, it's not very different.
That one stood out to me as well. Sorry, go ahead.
As an employee of a test production company, I'm very much in favor of the test battery argument. Please buy all the tests in the test battery.
That's very true. That I have had a little bit of experience with college admission, and in college admission, I mean, yeah, you can have a validity argument for each test, but it still is not that clear how to use them together, and you need some extra thinking about it. And actually, it kind of departs from the validity literature when you start to think in batteries. I remember there is like an Australian author, that he kind of analyzed the changes in the admission system and provided like a framework to analyze to evaluate basically. And when you enter in that realm, then you enter much more on the evaluation side, and that not necessarily is that closer to what typically we consider validity, but it still feels a lot like that. So yeah.
I do feel like there's so much tossed into this one chapter, because I do feel like if you're gonna dip your toes into trying to set some standards for those battery of tests, then give more guidance. Like go fully into it and really devote some time to thinking through how that works and what the standards should be. Because for a lot of these parts, it feels like they mention it or they kind of dip into it, but then they don't fully commit to providing that guidance. And I know it's tricky with this topic in particular, but it does feel like they're trying to just kind of gloss over certain parts of it, or just shift the responsibility to outside of the standards.
Now I think that in standard 10.1, those who use psychological tests should confine their testing and related assessment activities to their areas of competence, as demonstrated through education, training, experience, and appropriate credentials. I found that interesting because, right, in psychological testing, I think it becomes more clear that the person that interprets and use a test needs to be qualified, or that there is like a minimum requirement to do that properly. But in education, I don't think we have something similar. We are not expecting that the person that uses or interprets a score from educational testing should have certain level of preparation. And why not? I mean, yeah, the stakes in psychological testing are definitely more higher, but in education that can happen sometimes too. So yeah, that was interesting to think that maybe in education we should copy that too, that there's like a way of warning that it's not that simple. So it's not that you can just use the score and go.
I was kind of coming at this from the workplace testing side of life, and thinking this does not happen in the workplace. Like frequently the person administering it does not have the training experience or credentials. They're just giving you a test. And so should that be addressed in some way? Should they at least acknowledge the fact that in a workplace setting, this is not likely to happen? Or that the test should be more clearly labeled as to what is the expected education, training, and experience.
Maybe that's a good standard or potential standard to put that very clear also in the manual, in the instructions of the test. What's the expected credentials of the person that is using the thing? Yeah.
I know at our company we've been playing with the idea of having like training for teachers to take to reduce bias and discrimination when they take tests, stuff like that. But we haven't thought about it in terms of like the content of the test, really.
Mm.
Well, I think standard 10.2 goes right with standard 10.1 for those settings. I like this comment someone has already put here, that it mentions a logical analysis, not argument, when the rest of the document talks about argument.
Yeah, I found that weird. I mean, I can see eventually they are speaking of something else, but seems, I mean, when they say logical analysis in this context, seems to me like another type of argument at the end. So
The difference is made.
Have they defined logical analysis anywhere else that you're aware of in the manual?
I don't think so.
Yeah, it seems like a weird choice of words.
Yeah, and overall, I think, yeah, I'm trying to, when I was reading this, it was like, maybe this chapter is the chapter in which we will be less prepared as a group coming from NCME, because it's not that expected that we will have specific experiences related with psychological testing. However, still, it was inevitable at some point to kind of compare with educational testing and kind of see the chapter through those lenses from the place we are, basically. But yeah, yeah, maybe that's a good question for experts to understand more in more context, like what they could mean with logical analysis and why not argument or I don't know. I found very funny standard 10.10. Those who select test interpret results should not allow individuals or group with vested interest in the outcomes of an assessment to have an inappropriate influence on the interpretation of the assessment results. I mean, maybe we should copy that too.
Have we really not covered that anywhere else in the standards? Like, I feel like this should have been covered somewhere.
I mean, at least from the chapter we have read so far, I don't think that's mentioned in that way. Maybe in the following chapters in the educational testing chapter, we can see. But that makes a lot of sense. It's kind of obvious, but yeah, when I saw that, I was like, yeah, why this is here and not like before?
Yeah, why is this buried in chapter 10 in a chapter that a lot of people won't read because it doesn't apply to them? This feels like a standard that should be front and center somewhere else. And maybe a little bit obvious, but agreed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe the question is on the other side. can be said that in other parts of the standards. And yeah, maybe this can be said here because it's psychological testing and they are not that, how do I say that in English, co-opted, like constrained by the industry. But yeah, they can't say it, so they said it. At least it's somewhere. And actually, this for me, the idea at least of the standard, I yeah, I've been thinking through I've been thinking about this before the standard study group, but during the standard study group, I think that the idea have been crystallizing more that at some point we need a review of the code of ethics that we have. And the standards at some point intersect with that. Sometimes even people confuse it with that. Although it's not exactly like a specific explicitation of what are core values, it definitely is appearing all the time, like standards that are not just technical, are also like a value position. And I would say this is also that standard seems to me something that should pop up in some way in a code of conduct or something that could be more ethical in nature. And not only to kind of like agree or come up with an agreement as a community, but also as a way to protect ourselves. Because I can see that eventually when you are working, when you're having a client, when you are in different situations in the life of a psychometrician or someone in testing, they will receive pressure. They will be pushed to do things that maybe they don't agree with. And when you have a code of conduct that says you should not do this, then you have something that backs you up. And then you can say, I mean, I cannot do this because I will be kicked off of NCME if they do this. Or this is an agreement that we made as a community that we are not doing this. It's out of the question. So that kind of gives you a reason to say no, a strong reason actually. Because, for example, here in the comments of that standard at the end, in some instances, legal requirement may limit a professional's ability to prevent inappropriate interpretation of assessments for affecting decisions, but professionals have an obligation to document any disagreement in such circumstances. So how binding is that? I mean, it's a comment in the standards. You can say that to in a context and say the standards say I should like document this, but I mean, it's how many people are you convincing with? I mean, it's not that strong to kind of really use it in a real scenario. I don't know. Maybe it is, but.
Maybe this type of testing is just more prone to this sort of abuse. And maybe that's why it's here. But it would be nice if they maybe gave some examples. What does that look like? How is that likely to occur? How would you document that? To whom? Where? So it would, if this is something that is common in this type of testing, then maybe there should be a little bit more explicit information here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and kind of building off of that, like say that somebody was using a test inappropriately, like who do you go tell? Like there's not like a regulatory body who's like, oh, we're gonna, impose a fine or whatever. It's like there isn't really anybody to kind of act as like a sort of like a watchdog organization that like keeps track of this stuff. So that's kind of a missing thing just as an organization in general.
Well, also entails with this idea that should we have legislation or not? Actually, my advisor, Steve Siresi, he did like a session on NCME last year, in which they discussed the idea of having like a legal body that could eventually enforce some of the stuff in the standards. I myself, I like the idea a lot because I am kind of that type of guy in terms of the politics, that kind of I like regulation. But for me, it was always surprising why we don't have like an FDA. I remember when we were reading Shepard's famous chapter about, I think the name is Evaluating Validity, or I can't remember the title, but it's like a famous chapter that Shepard wrote, that she comments on method. And that actually is mentioned in the paper. That is we compare ourselves at some point with what happens in, how to say that, medicine or pharmacology, that you have an entity that kind of regulate what are the consequences of using certain chemicals for treating people. And it makes a lot of sense because it can be very dangerous. But for some reason, because people don't die because of test, then maybe it's not that important. But still, the consequence might be lower, but it's so widespread, it's so massive, that I think that justifies to have like an entity similar to FDA, in that you can kind of like certify if you are propagating a test that is not going to have like a negative impact by its use. Yeah, I don't know. That made a lot of sense to me when I started to see the parallels with biology, if you want.
Like some of these things do have consequences for people's lives, not in a way where it's like a life or death situation, but it's like if this is like a gatekeeper for a job to you and that's close to you, now you're kind of locked out of that chance for economic success. Or if you're a student and you needed some kind of accommodations and the test was inappropriate for you, so it seemed like you didn't have that disability, but in fact you did, then you're not getting the accommodations you need. So school is going to be that much harder. So it's not, these aren't like consequences like life or death, but they are consequences that do change people's lives. And so that's like, we aren't like the consequences of these tests decide things for you. So it's like, you know, there should be some kind of something backing that up instead of just people just sort of willy-nilly deciding what to do. Because yeah, that does change people's lives. So there are consequences there.
It could also be life or death because these are still used for like mental health diagnoses, right? And these things lead to medications, and those have the same kind of implications as medical tests.
That's very, very true. Yeah.
In the field that I come from in veterinary medicine, there's a very common instrument that is used in the workplace to evaluate compassion fatigue, which is, it's also called, it's a type of traumatic stress disorder. And the instrument's not even actually validated for veterinary medicine. And so that's why I keep comparing here, because I'm like, yeah, they're not doing any of these things and there's no oversight for that. But veterinary medicine has a suicide rate that's 3.5 times the national average. So there are extreme implications for making sure that you're accurately assessing people for traumatic stress disorder. So I agree. Yeah, these can be life and death things, but certainly it can impact your life in very large ways. And there's no oversight going on here.
Wow, I think you're right on that. That test, well, at least in psychological testing, these can quickly relate with actual medical treatment. And I think for educational testing, that's a very dreadful hypothesis that we don't explore that much. If students or people that do educational testing, they are affected in terms of their mental health, that could lead to suicidal in certain cases. And I think that's a very, very important question that we don't do, and it will be ugly for sure. And actually, yeah, I mean, yeah, apparently it's not like life death, but it perfectly can be for certain specific people. I mean, it won't be weird. I won't be surprised if you can see certain kind of greater rates that are moderated by the experiences that are elicited by either one single test that is very important, or by an exhaustion on the student because of many tests that are happening all the time. Yeah.
I think standard 10.12 is the one you were talking about, where it's not just the interpretation of the score, right? Oh yeah, the narrative goes on to talk about how we need to consider construct irrelevant variance.
Yeah, because at the end, a battery of tests, why is that different to a single test with a multi-dimensional result? I mean, it should be the same. So, I mean, actually, there might be tests that actually they give already like a multi-dimensional. So I don't think there should be that much difference between the validation of one single test or the validation of the interpretation and use of a battery of tests. It should be the same thing. It should be kind of like a continuation of an argument that start from the end of each of the tests and then add an extra layer for the specific use of combination of scores. How exactly do you do that?
I wonder if it's because psychological testing is so dependent on the individual and there's so many factors that'll come in for the individual that there's less of a way to standardize it. So there has to be some room for the person to interpret the individual and the context.
Yeah, but I mean, if that's the case, then why in education is different? Is it different?
Yeah.
I mean, for example, this idea from College Board to include like a extra information, or actually it is collateral information of the student, depending on the high school and all this kind of like contextual information goes in the same direction, in the sense that for a person, in college admission, the person that sees the score has this collateral information to kind of like interpret in a better way the score, which is the same thing. I mean, and I would say that always it is dependent on an individual, every single time. The problem is that we are more used in educational testing to do this kind of bulk interpretation, but that doesn't mean we are doing that correctly. I mean, the nuances and the specificities of each person are always too high. So, yeah.
That's a good point.
All right. So I think maybe if we don't have any other comments, we can start writing questions, because Professor Havle was saying that she's not going to be available the previous days before the Q&A session, and the first day in which she's available is like the day before. So if we can have like a list of questions like sooner, yeah, I think that will help to her. So maybe if we can spend some time now, that could be actually very helpful.
All right, I think standard 1010 we came up with, or we got close to some questions that we could form.
Yeah, sorry, I was concentrating on everything. What did you say, Stacy?
Nothing. I found where everybody was putting their questions, so we're good.
But yeah, I think you made some comments that might be questions too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think 1010 we had made a number of comments that I was like, I think we could turn those into questions, but I see
Yeah.
that people already are.
Okay. All right. Do you know how to put reactions? Have you seen that? No? Let me see if you are. Did you sign with like an email, or are you in the board like guests?
I'm a
I'm
guest.
in as a
user.
guest.
Let's see. Yeah, because let me share my screen to show you. Do you see my screen?
Yep.
Do you see that button?
Oh yeah.
the reaction button. Yeah, if you can see that, then when you click here, then your mouse is going to change. And then when you do a click with the mouse in that mode, then it will appear like a set of reactions. Then you can put like here. So we can do that also with the questions here to like rate them.
I don't have the little, I don't have that feature, but I can +1 some things.
Okay.
Yeah, me too.
Mm. All right, I think we are good. I will stop the recording. We can continue working on the questions if you want, but I think we are done for today on the discussion part. Do you have any other comment that you want to add? No? Okay.